This is Chris Schlarb. I'm here with my surprisingly old friend, Ronan Chris Murphy.
Howdy.
So if I've known you for 10 years or something around there.
Sounds about right.
How do you find yourself to make a living in the music business for at least twice that long?
I think it started to pay my rent probably in the very beginning of the 90s, so that's however long ago.
Yeah.
I always feel weirdly cocky, even though it's not correct. I think I was able to do it because I just worked harder than a lot of people.
Yeah.
I certainly don't have any natural gift or talent or anything like that. I just kind of fell in love with the idea of just making music. And, worked 7 days a week, years on end and things like that. So I think that was able to sort of move me along and get me towards opportunities. And I think also another big thing that I've always done is just really jumped at opportunities that, seemingly would have made no sense at all.
Right.
So it's, if there was a chance to go make a record on the other side of the world it would be hugely profitable, meaning I'd only lose a few $100 doing it. I'd jump on an airplane and go do it. And eventually, I'd made enough records that other people were kind of, people wanted me to keep making records for them.
So, I mean, it's funny because you say that you don't have any sort of like supernatural talent or something, but what I've noticed in working with you is that you have a kind of it's really interesting. It's almost like you have no guile. But I know that's not true because you need to have some to survive. Because it's kind of it's just like in any freelance business, you do not have the luxury of like sitting on your hands for very long.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's a component to your personality that is you're like incredibly easy to work with, and I think that's one reason why you survive. Right? I mean, the first time I hired you to mix Psychic Temple 3, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Just because I was so wound up about giving control over this final stage. It was totally irrational. You know what I mean? I knew that I was doing the right thing by hiring you. I knew I was going to learn so much, but it was still terrifying, utterly terrifying. I remember I had to walk around on my front lawn. But we were like mixing. I was just like, "Whoa, what's he doing?" He's like panning shit to hard left and hard right,
the way God intended it.
Yeah, which is exactly the way I do it now myself. But I think the fact that you sort of like let me work that out, whether you like even viewed it as like something that you had to even intervene in was, I think it says a lot about your ability to kind of like not only to then get the good work done, but to be a pleasure to be around, even in those kind of like difficult artistic kind of like those moments where the artistic process comes to this emotional grind.
Yeah, I mean it can occasionally be tough, but I think one of the things that I'm happy about is that there's a lot of people who've worked with me and said, this was actually fun. I've never had fun in the studio before. Right. And that just seems so kind of bizarre to me because, why else would we do this?
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of got the golden ticket that we get to wake up and do this stuff, and people will actually, make our car payments for us while we do this. Yeah. I mean, because all of this is, I shouldn't say this loud, but I mean, this is work I would do for free if I didn't have to deal with things like, healthcare and a home and all the kind of life stuff. It's because I did it for free before anyone paid me to do it, and
if all the work dried up,
Mm-hmm.
you do it for free afterward because you love to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of cool. And, sometimes, we all need to complain every once in a while. We sort of have this thing like, oh, God, this, client, blah, 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 oh, my God, the client wanted, such thing that took us a little extra time. And
Right.
I think it's really important for those of us who do this stuff as part of our job that our crappiest days a migrant farm worker would fantasize about.
I have thought about that. I mean, in the process of me trying to work on music full time, I was a truck driver for many years. And in between then, even as a truck driver, I think for a period of time I was only working 3 days a week. So I would pick up like an extra job. My uncle, my wife's uncle, I guess, my uncle-in-law, was a plumber. And so he goes, hey, you want to come work for me? And I was like, you got it. I spent like 10 hours digging a ditch. Mm-hmm. And I was like, fuck that. That's a terrible, that's an awful thing to have to do, And then it put a certain perspective on the whole, like, oh, like a bad day working on music is not equivalent to a normal day digging a ditch for me.
Yeah. And the fact that, I can, my job can be in saying, hey, can you play that bass part a little behind the beat?
Right.
And somebody will pay me more than what a migrant farm worker who does real work does.
Right.
It's just, I mean, we got the golden ticket on this.
Yeah.
And
so over the last few years, I feel like I haven't seen you very much. I know you used to have a studio, a physical location in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
And you ended up moving out into the mountains.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Which seemed to kind of coincide with like a lot of other things that I like just read about. I mean, we didn't have a chance to like kind of say like, you didn't check in with me and say, hey, Chris, here's what's going on in my life.
Is this going to be okay with you?
Yeah. Do I have your permission? And I was like, no, actually, you need to stay in Santa Monica, if you please. So I think I just am putting my memories, back together. But you ended up working on like this like Mafia video game.
Yeah, Mafia III.
Okay.
A big, console video game.
Like AAA title.
Yeah.
Doing a bunch of like recording for that and engineering and mixing.
Yeah, I record on the music side. I didn't do anything in terms of sound effects or dialogue, but I recorded, mixed, and mastered all the music for that.
Okay. So that's like in-game music or the score or?
Both. So I mean,
Okay.
it's in game, and really like what they're doing in terms of the most exciting audio work in the world right now, I think, is video games.
Right. Yeah.
So basically, it was original score, and so but when you're talking about AAA video games, it's not just we're making a linear record. So we're
Right.
actually recording and mixing and those kind of things in a way that the music is interactive, which is
Right, because you have like what is it, like F mod and all of these types of things where like in a game you could have, let's say, a theoretical band playing in a room. Your character in the game is outside of the room, but is hearing the band, and all of that processing of the way that your ear would hear that sound is being done through a number of different, like, programs.
Yeah, well, that's kind of stuff falls into the world of sound effects, and which is kind of amazing because, like, literally, if your character is many times walking into a room, and there's a wood wall on one side and a window on the other side of your character, the ambience will be different,
Right?
Because wood sounds different from glass. But essentially, what on the work that I've done in video games, it's the score, which generally is of its own thing. But the kind of interactivity on that would be the composers will work on a piece of music where it's playing, but then if your character walks into enemy territory, the music will change, get a little bit more intense,
Right.
And then if enemy characters can see you, again, the music jumps up to a different level.
Right.
And then if you go into fighting or combat, the same piece of music evolves into a different level.
Sure.
Which is
So
kind of amazing.
Are you having to? So it almost kind of starts to blur the line between like mixing and and mastering a little bit, right? Because in a way, what used to be just a static 2-channel audio mix is now being essentially like we're having like the exploded view of it, because like all the pieces are in play.
Yeah, and it ends up being very STEM based, and
Right, yeah.
the audio lead for that game, Matt Bauer, is just really incredible at having the big picture on that.
Yeah.
So I was mixing it, but delivering stems, because different layers of stems are ways that they would kind of recreate that, and we'd record different versions of the same piece of music with different levels of intensity, and so that they would kind of have those things playing back interactively. So had to sort of create a way that would do that, and but also stand alone, because there's a soundtrack score for it. So it's a great score. I mean, the guys who did the music for it are fantastic. And if you look up Mafia 3 on Spotify or something like that, you can hear it. And the guys did amazing work on it.
So if people do that and listen to it, your hand in it was recording, mixing, mastering.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Wow. So how long did that project take?
Yeah. Lots and lots of time if you think of hours, but in terms of basically a month.
Okay.
So it was basically 2 weeks tracking, 2 weeks mixing, and of course, the rest of the team in terms of composing was on it long before I showed up, and then the audio team in terms of implementation was doing a lot after I left. But I was pretty much on board for 4 to 5 weeks of pretty intense work.
And am I right in remembering you did that stuff in Nashville?
Yeah, we did
Blackbird?
the tracking. We did Ocean Way, Nashville, and House of Blues.
House of Blues, sorry.
And that was a really kind of funny experience, because I'm always I always get a little bit nervous working in the studio with musicians I haven't worked with before. I mean, I like it, but when there's a lot on the line.
Yeah, it's nerve-wracking.
Yeah, just because there's people I know, like the musicians I work with and hire a lot. I know they're great musicians. I know what their strengths are. I know they'll be cool to the clients and all of that kind of thing. But this was basically set up by the team. So I was kind of walking into it with a bunch of musicians I'd never worked with. And the score from Mafia 3, it's really kind of cool, but it's set in a more or less fictional 1968 New Orleans. And so I ended up getting brought in because a lot of guitar music, and I've worked with a lot of, great guitar players and stuff. So they wanted somebody who kind of had experience with rock and blues and guitar-based stuff.
Yeah.
And I was a little nervous because Nashville is full of amazing musicians, but kind of a little clean cut, so to speak, stylistically. And I was kind of wondering about that. And it was funny when we were working on the tracks, like even the first day, like the guys were like technically kind of just nailing it, but not quite the vibe and the groove, kind of trying to get them to cut loose. And
almost more like classical players or something.
Yeah, I mean, but they were like Nashville guitar players.
Okay,
when you play a Nashville record, you're real straight, and this is the box you work in. And I kind of kept trying to push them, and then kind of like by the second day, they sort of realized he's not kidding. And so, and they just started to kind of loosen up and were amazing to work with. And even going back and mixing, and I can even kind of hear on the album some of the things like, oh yeah, that's before they realized they actually really were allowed to be rock and roll and swing,
stretch out a little
all
bit.
that kind of thing. And it was a fantastic experience.
I'm curious for you, it's interesting, because we've both worked in both like straight record production and on the video game music as well. And I'm curious for you, maybe what the biggest difference for you, beside from having a budget, is, because I see these interesting parallels all the time. Back in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, like in a way, like the record was like the thing, was the king.
Yeah.
Like that's what you spent your money on. That, and then now it's a video game, and that's why people spend millions and millions of dollars, because they're going to sell you this thing for 60, 70, 80, 90 bucks when it's done, maybe more through DLC and all this kind of stuff. So I'm kind of curious for you, like, knowing that you can essentially apply so many of the skills from making records to working on video game projects. What are the kind of like, what is that like for you, kind of like jumping back and forth between the two?
To me, they aren't radically different because it's still music.
Right.
The pro of it is actually, for me, that I don't have a life that allows me a lot of times, but I actually love kind of open world video games. And for me, like I did just a tiny bit of work on Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, which is just one of my favorite media things of all time.
Yeah.
And when I'm playing Mafia 3, I'm just like so blown away that to just be such a hardcore fan of something and go, wait, I actually kind of helped do this. That's kind of awesome.
Yeah.
And amazing. The downside is, or the challenge is, I'm such a record guy that when you're making a record, music is king. It is everything. And when you start to work on something like a video game, and people who do a lot of work in film work deal with this as well, is it's all of a sudden like, wait, music isn't the most important thing.
Right.
And again, like Mafia 3 had Matt Bauer, this great audio lead, who's kind of keep me in check. He's like, wow, that sounds killer, but we've got dialogue here.
Right.
But we need to hear footsteps.
Right.
We need to. So you have to make a lot of those kind of configurations in terms of the role it will play. And again, it's the same thing that people who do a lot of work in film do as well. And, when I tiptoe into this, and, I got lucky on the video game thing because, one of my dearest friends in the world is this guy, John Rod, who's an amazing, amazing engineer who works on, he mixed all the music for Get Out and things like that, and big Hollywood things. But also he works on a lot of the music for a lot of the biggest video game franchises in the world, and luckily I've had some cool career things by getting his leftovers happily. Since he's so busy, sometimes I get thrown bones when people are trying to triple book him.
Sure. That's cool. It's interesting because it makes me think a lot about how modern, like especially a AAA video game, let's say like Mafia or Red Dead Redemption 2 or these games they're like the modern day equivalent of like theater. They require like so many different disciplines, and in some regards it makes me like really happy because I think about how many different artistic disciplines are required to bring something to fruition. Graphic designers, writers, voiceover artists. It's like they're employing a lot of people. But then I get a little bummed out in thinking that like it's the only thing that is paying the, you know what I mean? Like, what about the theater itself? Or what about film? Or what about records? Or all of the, all of the sort of subgenre, the subdisciplines that would go into it, they are almost being like leached of value. And I wonder, I don't know that I'm not blaming video games. But I'm just looking at like the way that like society has kind of like slow, like what was it in the 80s when like David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear? The trick to that was that they were just on a slowly like rotating platform, and then he's just like going through all this pomp and circumstance, and like in an hour they're facing away from the Statue of Liberty or some shit, And I kind of wonder if that is kind of the equivalent of like what's happening, where it's sort of like, okay, like, you want to do music, you want to be an engineer, you want to be an artist or writer, here, video games. And it's kind of like, like that is a great avenue,
and I think it's some of the greatest works of art in the world right now are video games.
And I think part of it is because that's where people are putting their money, right? Like you put your money in something, but then I kind of feel like there becomes like this sort of consolidation practice where it's kind of like, oh, well then guys who just write for Hollywood now are getting all the gigs to write for a video game, and they don't understand the craft of the game, You know me, I'm always finding the cup is always half empty. So, all right. So to another of my sort of, my desires. I don't think that I ever really found out the kind of the 100% true Ronan Chris Murphy story of how did you wind up working on all these King Crimson records with Robert Fripp?
That one's there's a somewhat linear trend to that. So essentially, I was working at a studio in Boston, and I essentially got fired because I wouldn't participate in their religion. And
The studio's religion?
yes. And
They were only tape.
exactly. But anyway, so I'd lost my job.
No
but,
digital.
So I was just walking around doing nothing, and I went down in a subway, and I saw this guy playing guitar, a black shallow body Ovation, kind of dunk ding 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 ding. I'm like, wow, that's like Guitarcraft kind of music.
Yeah.
And I just hung out and watched the dude, and my train came and went, and I stayed and watched him and started talking with him, and it ended up being this guitar player named Steve Ball, who's just one of the most crazy, brilliant people I've ever known in my life. But we got along, and he's like, hey, I've got some stuff to record. Do you want to, get in the studio with me? I said yes. And
You're like, wait a minute, what's your religion?
exactly. And will you fire me if I don't support it?
What are the religious requirements of this recording job?
But we started kind of working together and collaborating, and we did a whole bunch. And he ended up he was one of the members of Robert Fripp in the League of Crafty Guitarists, and one of the kind of original old guard of Guitarcraft. And we did a bunch of work together, and then I moved to Canada for a couple of years.
In hopes of working on a Tragically Hip record.
Well, I wasn't in love with him yet. It was being
Yeah.
in Canada that made me in love with him.
It's in the water.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, one of the great regrets of my entire career is that I didn't get to do a record for the Tragically Hip, but that's all right.
Sorry to bring that up.
But anyway, I ended up moving to Seattle, kind of by Steve's coaxing. He had moved out to Seattle, and we ended up doing a bunch of stuff together. And then one day, this guy had been kind of on the road with Fripp, because Fripp tours with this giant, it's just almost like a recording studio, his guitar rig.
Right.
And this guy was sort of leaving it, and they needed somebody else, and I got recommended for it, and I met Fripp one day, and he's like, "Want to do this?" I'm like, "Yeah, okay."
Yeah.
And so I went out on the G3 tour with Fripp and Steve Vai and Joe Satriani, and
I still like that whole thing is hilarious to me. I mean, I just saw, it's interesting to chart kind of Fripp's his position on the physical stage over the years, because I just saw like the new version of King Crimson with like 10 drummers and like plexiglass, like gospel chops, plexiglass in between everybody. And Fripp was like all the way over on the right-hand side, headphones on, surrounded by stuff with like a giant like wall of gear in front of him. And I was just thinking, like, it made me think all the years back to like, Court of the Crimson King era, where like, there's that story about Greg Lake saying like, you can't sit on the stage, you look like a mushroom. and he's had the last laugh, obviously.
there you go.
I've never seen a more mushroom-looking guitar player
At
in all
least
my
he's lit
years.
on stage now. Some of the King Crimson tours, for a while, they wouldn't even have a light on him. But at least he's illuminated now.
Right. Yeah, you know where
Big
he
step
is.
forward.
You should have a little like neon sign that's like with an arrow. Here's Robert Fripp.
Exactly.
So he ends up hiring you to go out. Is this like all Frippertronic stuff, solo?
Yeah, the
Fripp?
kind of the soundscape stuff.
Yeah.
So he was sort of the opening. He was the fourth guitar player of the G3 tour.
Right.
And we did this tour, and then
How dare they?
Exactly. And then at the end of the tour, he's like, "I've got some stuff that needs mixed in England. Do you want to come over and do it?" I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
And it was great, because he and I kind of connected and worked together almost nonstop for a couple years. So when he'd go on the road, I'd go on the road, and when we weren't on the road, most of that time I'd be working on records. And it was during King Crimson was doing this thing called the Projects.
Oh yeah,
where the big six-piece band kind of broke up into these modular units and would do records. And so, I mean, depending on how you do the math, I've done like over a dozen King Crimson records. Just because it was this really weird, prolific time of, kind of experimental things and stuff like that.
This is sort of like I'm trying to jog my own memory because I saw the six-piece band, like the double trio band, at the Wiltern in like '95. Yeah. So this has to be somewhere around '96, '7.
Yep. Yeah, about 90. Yeah, probably '97 or so is when I kind of came on board, start working with him.
Yeah. So this is after Thrack.
Yeah,
and
it was the Ashes and
yeah, but that band was like, I remember being like utterly like blown away by that band at the time. I mean, Baloo was up there playing like a Roland V guitar, and I'm like in the audience and I'm hearing like a Cecil Taylor piano, and I'm thinking, they have a piano up there, and it's him. I was just like, what on earth am I listening to? So all of these kind of project records, in addition to like soundscape records.
Yeah, and I think some of the sound stuff. I recorded a bunch of that. I'm actually not sure what happened.
Yeah.
Somebody told me that some of that came out, but I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah.
But I did that. Also, just some live albums they did. I remixed the USA album from, which was great.
Right.
And then, one of the early classic 70s lineups, which was so awesome because
John Wetton.
Yeah, it's basically it was mixing a Tool record. It was it was just so heavy and fantastic.
Man, it's like, isn't Crimson kind of like what Tool wants to be?
Oh, Tool would admit that. Yeah. And I always figured like David Bottrell was King Crimson's mixer before I started working with them. So I figured, okay, when he's done being Tool's guy, I can be Tool's guy.
Right.
But apparently working with Tool is a really intense experience. I think their work process is about as intense as the music.
Right. So you kind of have this. You get fripped, basically.
Yeah.
You have this kind of intense period of like work, and then what happens after that?
Well, it was kind of thing. We worked together, and then we just kind of decided to go our separate ways, and not a big dramatic story there, but the big thing for me is I actually I had to try really hard not to be the prog rock guy. And
I was going to ask about this. And
it was because that's all the calls I was getting. And, so I'd be working with the, talk with some like cool artist or something, like a singer-songwriter kind of thing. And they're like, oh, yeah, you wouldn't be interested in what I do. And I'm like, Neil Young is the reason I'm a musician. It's like, and so it was getting to the thing where that was the only kind of jobs that were, getting offered to me. So I had to force myself to get out of that. And I've been really blessed because I've got to work with some of the greatest prog artists in the world. But that's just like a little sliver of the stuff I like. And so if it was a kind of thing where, there'd be, okay, I had potential to work on two projects, a prog thing that actually paid pretty good money and a punk thing or a singer-songwriter thing that paid like half that much money. I would take the prog, or like the punk or the singer-songwriter thing, just because I didn't want to have a career of being pigeonholed.
Right. To diversify a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I was always diverse before I started.
Well, I mean, you've worked a lot with like Tony Levin.
Yeah.
And I think like a lot of people know him obviously for Crimson.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was also in that like early 80s version of Crimson, which sounded totally different than like any other Crimson period. But before that, he was like playing with like John Lennon. You know what I mean?
Well, even, yes. And
just like Alan White. It's so funny because a lot of these people who are like these prog icons.
And Buddy Rich. But I'll tell you a fun thing about Tony Levin, who just I think I've learned more just being able to work with him than anybody else in the world. But, we've been on tours and stuff together, and amazing thing is when you're on the road with people or hang out in the studio, you end up at lunch breaks telling stories. Oh,
Right.
when I did this with so-and-so and that, and it's usually related to, this funny thing happened. But he'll talk about his time working with Peter Gabriel or John Lennon with the exact same reverence that he talked about his time working with Don Ho or Donnie and Marie.
Right.
Because there's never been a this is above me or beneath. It's like, it was a chance to, do some music and
Right.
brought to it what I could and
Yeah. Here's
things
what I
like that.
learned.
Yeah,
Yeah. That seems like a healthy way to approach music. I mean, I was in high school, I was like playing in like gangster rap ensembles. Like in high school, I would, get picked up and be taken out to a session in Inglewood, and we'd cut like a gangster rap track.
Yeah.
And, then I'd come back to school the next day and play in the gospel choir.
yeah,
It was just music.
yeah.
I wasn't kind of like saying, well, one's cool, one's not cool.
Yeah.
I was just learning a ton from both of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's some music that I don't really resonate with as much as others and things like that. And here's kind of an amazing thing too, that it's amazing how often you meet people who are just the pinnacle of some style of music, and it's amazing how often they're obsessed with a kind of music that's completely not what you think.
Totally, yeah.
Heavy metal guys who are just like obsessed about jazz, or jazz guys who are just obsessed about, African high life music or
Right.
things like that. Because really, the most interesting musicians and the greatest musicians usually tend to be, that punk drummer who's just totally obsessed with old school R&B.
Yeah.
Because they tend to do, in my experience, tend to do some of the most interesting music. And
Yeah, like Watt's obsessed with Coltrane.
yeah,
I remember one time I was at Nels Klein's house and we were just talking about like Astor Piazzolla. Mm-hmm. But, it's just kind of like, this is the greats like love all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. They bring this like world of love and experience.
and for me, in terms of stuff I love, I'm a complete musical mutt. Because, I love Coltrane like most people, but there's also some Britney Spears tracks that I'm crazy about.
Yeah.
And, I grew up really intensely into Neil Young and American hardcore and stuff like that. But for me, I love, one of the reasons I love bouncing around is that